Queen Elizabeth says she wants Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, to be known as Queen Consort when Prince Charles becomes king.
According to 17, while Charles' wife is referred to as Queen Camilla,
Queen Camilla's world was shaken not in the grandeur of Buckingham Palace, but within the quiet walls of her cherished Raymill retreat. What began as a private moment soon spiraled into a storm that no royal guard could contain. Whispers turned into headlines, loyalty into suspicion, and the weight of history pressed harder than ever on the monarchy's fragile image. Could this mark the most heartbreaking chapter of her journey as Queen Consort? Stay with us, because what follows will leave you stunned. A queen under watchful eyes. Camilla's rise to the throne was not the fairy tale ascent many imagined for a queen. It was a story laced with scars from the past, a crown worn under the shadow of controversy rather than celebration. For decades, she had been branded as the other woman, the figure blamed for the heartbreak of Diana, Princess of Wales. Newspapers ridiculed her, television commentators dissected her every move, and cartoons caricatured her as an interloper who had stolen what was never meant to be hers. That reputation clung to her like smoke, impossible to fully escape, even when the crown finally rested upon her head. Her coronation in 2023 might have looked like a victory, but for Camilla, it was more like an uneasy truce. The blessing of Queen Elizabeth II had paved her way, giving her legitimacy in the eyes of tradition. Yet, legitimacy is not the same as love. Crowds gathered, the ceremonies were grand, and history recorded her as Queen Consort. But in the quiet glances of the public, there was hesitation. Cheering for her often sounded more like politeness than genuine admiration. And when she stood beside Charles, the cameras captured the truth that words could not disguise. She was tolerated, but never fully embraced. Why did doubts persist even at the height of her reign? Part of the answer lies in the enduring memory of Diana. Her image was never dimmed by time. To many, Catherine, Princess of Wales, became Diana's echo, graceful, compassionate, and adored. In contrast, Camilla appeared stiffer, colder, her charm unable to spark the same warmth. It was a comparison she could never outrun, a reminder that crowns may be inherited, but affection must be earned. The monarchy survives not on gold or jewels, but on perception. And for Camilla, perception was her greatest enemy. Each smile seemed measured, each wave calculated, as if she herself knew the crown she wore was fragile. But could a queen survive when her subjects never truly claimed her as their own? Stay with us. This is only the beginning. The house that held secrets. For most people, a countryside retreat is simply a place to breathe, to step away from the weight of responsibility. For Queen Camilla, that place was Raymill House, a sprawling estate tucked away in Wiltshire, purchased in the 1990s long before she married Charles. To her, it was more than a home. It was a sanctuary, a refuge where she could shed the stiffness of royal formality, surrounded not by courtiers or cameras, but by the familiar comfort of her own choosing. Here, she could live as Camilla Parker Bowles, not as the Queen Consort. Yet in the eyes of critics, Raymill became something else entirely. Unlike Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle, Raymill was private, beyond the gaze of the institution, and that secrecy fueled suspicion. Why did she cling to it so fiercely, even after stepping into the grandeur of royal life? Why choose the countryside over the palaces of history? To many, it felt like she was maintaining a parallel world, one foot inside the monarchy, the other firmly outside it. Over the years, whispers gathered like storm clouds. Stories circulated of private dinners held there, long after her marriage to Charles. Politicians quietly invited, influential guests slipping in unnoticed. To supporters, these were harmless social gatherings, but to detractors, they were red flags. Was this merely a queen seeking comfort in familiarity? Or was Raymill being used for something far more complicated? The symbolism could not be ignored. Palaces represent continuity, tradition, the visibility of the crown. Raymill represented secrecy, distance, and the possibility of shadows hidden from public view. Every time Camilla chose to spend a weekend there instead of at Windsor, her decision whispered a message louder than words. This was where her loyalties felt safest. And then, as years passed, the contrast sharpened into something unavoidable. Catherine's appearances at official residences, charming children in school halls, laughing with volunteers at hospitals, went viral. Meanwhile, Camilla's preference for Raymil left an air of detachment, a queen seen as retreating from her people. The estate no longer seemed a harmless retreat. To the public, it began to look like a vault for secrets, a place where the monarchy's unseen dramas might unfold. Could one house really carry such weight? Could stone walls and quiet gardens become the stage for whispers that threatened a crown? The answer, as events would prove, was far more unsettling than anyone imagined. Don't blink. You'll want to hear what surfaced next. The crown's fragile numbers. For centuries, the monarchy has stood as a symbol of continuity, unchanged through wars, revolutions, and shifting tides of history. Its strength was always said to rest on tradition, not on popularity. But by the mid-20s, cracks in that belief began to show. In the age of social media, televised spectacles, and endless polls, numbers mattered more than ever. And in those numbers, Queen Camilla found no safety. While Catherine, Princess of Wales, enjoyed approval ratings that soared above 70 and sometimes even 80%, Camilla's hovered stubbornly in the low 30s and often dipped lower. These weren't just statistics. They were signals, verdicts delivered not in courtrooms, but in living rooms across Britain. The monarchy, for all its rituals and crowns, now relied on public affection to survive. Without it, the institution risked crumbling into irrelevance. The contrast between Catherine and Camilla could not have been more brutal. Catherine's every public engagement became a viral moment. A photo of her crouching to speak with toddlers at a children's charity captured hearts worldwide. A clip of her embracing a grieving mother was replayed across networks, framed as proof of her warmth and relatability. In those images, people saw Diana's legacy reborn, a familiar grace that reassured them the future of the crown was secure. Meanwhile, Camilla's appearances often told a different story. Photographs showed her stiff, unsmiling, lifting a glass at formal lunches or standing uncomfortably at public events. The optics were merciless. One woman appeared vibrant and natural, the other distant and constrained. Side by side, the gulf was undeniable, and with every poll that widened the gap, Camilla's position seemed less like a triumph and more like a liability. Inside the palace, the tension grew heavier with each passing month. Advisors quietly warned Charles that public patience was wearing thin. Princess Anne, ever devoted to duty, voiced her concerns bluntly, and Prince William, already wary of Camilla's growing influence, began to question how much longer the monarchy could weather such unflattering comparisons. If the people had already chosen their queen in spirit, and it wasn't the woman crowned beside Charles, what future did that leave for Camilla? For a monarchy built on ceremony, perception was now the battlefield. The gleaming jewels and grand processions could no longer shield the royal family from the judgment of statistics. A 2024 survey made it painfully clear. When asked who best represented the monarchy's future, 58% of the public named Catherine. Only 12% chose Camilla. Numbers like these weren't fleeting opinions. They were seismic shifts, the kind that determined legacies. Could tradition alone hold the line when the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict? Could Camilla truly embody the crown when most of the nation's heart had already turned toward another? These questions were not whispered in corners anymore. They echoed across headlines, commentaries, and even within palace walls. The crown, fragile as glass, no longer felt secure upon Camilla's head. And with every new poll, every photo comparison, the balance tilted further. So was the monarchy adapting to a new age? Or was it on the brink of tearing itself apart under the weight of numbers? Keep watching, because numbers can topple crowns. Whispers at the palace walls. Behind the gilded gates of Buckingham Palace and the echoing halls of Windsor, life may appear choreographed, serene, even timeless. But those who worked closest to the Queen Consort began to notice small details that didn't fit the royal script. At first, they seemed like harmless peculiarities. Camilla requesting briefings usually reserved for the sovereign, asking pointed questions about policy, or hosting carefully curated dinners at Raymill. Yet when pieced together, these fragments painted a picture of a consort stepping into a role she was never meant to hold. Staff who had served generations of royals whispered uneasily about blurred boundaries. Aides recalled Camilla's unusual requests, summaries of parliamentary debates, updates on sensitive government discussions, even notes from meetings Charles had attended alone. One dismissed it as curiosity. Another described it differently. She wants to know more than a consort should. That comment, shrugged off at the time, later came to feel prophetic. Her influence extended beyond paper and briefing notes. Guests at Raymill were not always friends or family. Reports filtered back of discreet gatherings involving politicians, influential donors, and cultural figures. To the public, they might have seemed like social dinners, but to those inside palace walls, they carried the scent of quiet lobbying. Was Camilla simply building relationships, or was she weaving a network of influence parallel to the king's own? The whispers did not stop there. Palace insiders noticed how loyalties shifted around her. Courtiers once devoted solely to Charles began to spend more time attending to Camilla's requests. Staff described subtle tests of allegiance: who carried her messages promptly, who passed information discreetly, who hesitated. Aides spoke of hallways filled with nervous glances, conversations lowered to hushed tones when her name surfaced. To some, it was palace life, as usual, layered with protocol and secrecy. To others, it looked like fault lines deepening beneath the crown. Complicating it all was the family dynamic. Princess Anne, deeply committed to duty, voiced her unease. William, measured in public but wary in private, grew colder in his dealings with Camilla. The specter of Diana still lingered, making any perception of overreach by Camilla a raw and sensitive matter. Even Catherine's silent presence, her growing radiance in the public eye, made every misstep by Camilla feel heavier, every whisper more dangerous. What began as scattered murmurs among staff began to solidify into something harder to dismiss. Memos circulated quietly, noting unusual meetings. Advisors kept files of comments and observations. None of it amounted to scandal in isolation, but together, it felt like a dossier being built in real time, one that could shatter the illusion of harmony at the very heart of the monarchy. Were these whispers nothing more than palace intrigue, destined to fade like so many rumors before them? Or were they the early cracks in a foundation already weakened by public doubt? The line between loyalty and betrayal grew thinner with each passing day, leaving insiders to wonder how long before whispers became accusations. It only grows more intense from here. The confrontation no one saw coming. For weeks, tensions simmered just below the surface of royal life. Public appearances carried on as though nothing had changed. Camilla smiling stiffly beside Charles, Catherine dazzling crowds with warmth, William keeping a measured but icy composure. Yet behind closed doors, the atmosphere had grown heavy, electric with unease. Whispers that had once been confined to staff corridors had now reached the ears of the royals themselves, forcing them to confront the question no one dared to voice aloud. Was Camilla crossing a line that no consort should ever cross? It began with Princess Anne. Known for her bluntness and devotion to duty, she had tolerated the storms of gossip for decades. But the revelations of private meetings at Raymill, coupled with Camilla's growing appetite for influence, were too much for her silence to bear. In a private meeting with Charles, she delivered her warning without hesitation. "The crown is not your possession," she reportedly told him. "It belongs to the people, and she is damaging it." Her words, calm but cutting, landed like steel. For Charles, who had spent a lifetime defending Camilla, the message was almost unbearable. Yet Anne was not alone. William, though more cautious in speech, allowed his actions to speak louder than words. His posture in family gatherings grew colder, his interactions with Camilla clipped and distant. Behind the scenes, His frustration boiled over when he learned of her lobbying for greater roles for her children. To him, this was not harmless ambition. It was an insult to Diana's memory, a rewriting of history he could never accept. When he confronted Charles, insiders said his fury was unmistakable. He viewed Camilla not merely as a stepmother, but as a rival force threatening to bend the monarchy in her own image. The confrontation could no longer be delayed. A meeting was arranged deep within Buckingham Palace, in an oak-paneled chamber chosen for its privacy. The setting was deliberate. This was not a spectacle for the cameras, but a reckoning for the family alone. Charles sat at the head, visibly torn, while Anne and William flanked him, representing tradition and the future in equal measure. Camilla entered with her chin high, her gaze steady, the same composure that had carried her through decades of ridicule. But this time, there was no crowd to cheer her resilience, no sympathetic glance from her husband to shield her. The charges, if not formal, were clear. Anne voiced them with the calm authority of a woman who had given her entire life to the crown. William added the weight of the next generation's judgment, silent at first, but his stare unwavering. And then Charles spoke. His voice trembled, not with anger, but with heartbreak. He laid out the grievances, private dealings, overreach into governance, whispers of ambition beyond her role, and above all, the Raymil discovery that had cast her loyalty into question. Camilla's composure cracked. Witnesses later recalled the moment her lips tightened, her hand clutching the table's edge. "You cannot mean this," she whispered, her voice a mix of disbelief and desperation. For decades, she had fought through public humiliation, tabloids, and scandal, clinging to the certainty of Charles's loyalty. To imagine him wavering now, before his sister, before his son, was unthinkable. But Charles pressed on. His words, though trembling, were unyielding. He reminded her that the monarchy survived only on trust, and that trust had been broken. To Camilla, it must have felt like betrayal from the man who had stood by her against the world. To the others in the room, it was the moment the monarchy reclaimed its boundaries. The confrontation ended not in shouting, but in silence. A silence so heavy it seemed to echo louder than any accusation. In that stillness, the future of Camilla's crown, once unshakable in her eyes, hung by a thread. But what unfolded in that chamber would not only define her fate, but alter the monarchy's path forever. What unfolded next would change everything. A verdict in silence. The chamber chosen for the meeting was not the grand ballroom where monarchs had celebrated triumphs, nor the council room where official decisions were announced. Instead, it was a smaller, oak-paneled hall tucked deep inside Buckingham Palace, away from the echoes of history, chosen for its privacy. The walls were lined with portraits of past rulers, their painted eyes watching as though they bore witness to a moment that would define the crown's future. Camilla entered the room with her usual determination. Chin high, shoulders squared, her calm presence cultivated over decades of surviving ridicule. For years, that composure had been her shield against tabloids and whispers. But today, there were no cameras to sway, no public to convince. Only family sat before her, and their eyes did not soften. Charles sat at the head of the table, visibly weary. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled papers he barely needed, documents outlining whispers that had hardened into evidence. Private dinners, calls with political figures, her insistence on Raymil as a parallel seat of influence, and the artifact that symbolized a crown she may never have deserved. His love for Camilla had carried them through storms, but now, that very love was tested against the weight of monarchy. Anne was the first to speak. Her voice was calm, clipped, but sharp enough to pierce the tension. "The monarchy exists for the people," she said firmly. "It cannot serve ambition." The words were not spoken with cruelty, but with the authority of a woman who had lived her entire life in service to duty. William remained silent, his expression more damning than words. His gaze, fixed and cold, carried the legacy of his mother. For Camilla, that silence must have felt louder than any accusation. At last, Charles began. His voice quivered at first, the sound of a man torn in two. He spoke of loyalty, how she had endured ridicule, how she had stood by him through exile in the court of public opinion. He admitted her resilience had been the force that allowed him to survive decades of being overshadowed by Diana's memory. For a moment, it seemed as though his words might turn into a defense, another act of devotion. But then his tone hardened. He listed the grievances, her growing influence, her interference in matters meant only for the sovereign, her lobbying for her children's place within royal circles, and finally, the discovery at Raymill, a symbol too toxic to dismiss. "The crown," he declared, his eyes finally lifting to meet hers, "is not mine to give. It is not yours to shape. It belongs to the people, and their trust has been broken." The words hit like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled among the aides standing along the walls. Even those who had expected such a verdict seemed shaken to hear it spoken aloud. Camilla's composure cracked. Witnesses later recalled her lips trembling, her hand gripping the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. "After everything," she whispered, her voice breaking, "after all I have given?" But Charles did not relent. Tears glistened in his eyes, yet his resolve was unyielding. He continued, declaring that the title of Queen Consort would end that day. Decades of devotion, of shared defiance against the world, collapsed into silence. Anne broke that silence with only 2 words: "It's time." They carried the weight of centuries of tradition, of every monarch who had placed duty above personal desire. William did not speak, but his silence was enough. His stare, cold, unflinching, was as though Diana herself spoke through her son's expression. To Camilla, it was the final blow. She staggered back, her face pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. This was the moment she had feared most and thought impossible, that the man who had once defended her against an entire nation would now strip her of the very crown she had fought to claim. The chamber fell into heavy quiet, the kind of silence that follows thunder. The verdict had been spoken. Love had yielded to duty, or perhaps, as some would later argue, the crown had sacrificed one of its own. The nation reacts. The words had barely left Charles's lips when the silence inside Buckingham Palace began to fracture. Courtiers whispered in alarm, aides scribbled notes, and before long, the inevitable occurred. The verdict escaped those oak-paneled walls. What had been intended as a private reckoning became public thunder. And as the news broke across headlines, Queen Consort no more, the nation's streets lit with grief, anger, and disbelief. Outside the palace gates, crowds gathered quickly, as though history itself demanded witnesses. Some came with candles, their flames flickering in the dusk like a vigil for a fallen figure. Photographs of Diana were raised aloft, her memory once again invoked, as though she had triumphed from beyond the grave. Others carried placards in defense of Camilla, accusing the monarchy of betrayal, of sacrificing loyalty for survival. The atmosphere was both mournful and combative, a vigil and a battlefield in equal measure. On social media, the reaction was no less explosive. Hashtags like #JusticeForDiana and #QueenNoMore trended within minutes. Images of Camilla standing beside Charles at her coronation were reposted alongside captions that now read like epitaphs. Yet interwoven with scorn were messages of sorrow, sympathy for a woman who had endured decades of ridicule only to be discarded when she believed she was finally secure. It was, in every sense, heartbreaking news for Queen Camilla, her triumph rewritten into tragedy before the eyes of millions. But was the monarchy protecting itself or exposing its fragility? That was the question echoing across talk shows, newspaper columns, and cafe conversations. Some saw Charles's act as decisive, proof that the crown could correct itself and defend the institution above personal attachments. Others painted him as weak, a king who betrayed the very woman who had stood by him through scorn and scandal. For monarchists, the spectacle was unsettling. If a queen consort could be erased so abruptly, what security did any royal title hold? Was loyalty within the crown conditional, destined to vanish the moment numbers turned sour? For Republicans, however, it was proof of the monarchy's instability, a family drama spilling into national life, exposing the institution's dependence on image over substance. Meanwhile, Catherine and William emerged unintentionally as the silent victors. Their presence reassured the crowds, their popularity a balm against the turbulence. Footage of Catherine visiting a children's hospice just days after the announcement spread like wildfire. Her warmth and composure standing in painful contrast to Camilla's isolation. Polls taken in that same week showed Catherine's approval soaring to historic highs, while Camilla's collapsed into single digits. For Camilla herself, the heartbreak was complete. Stripped of her title, erased from official portraits and stationery, she became a solitary figure in the public imagination. Once a queen, now cast aside. To her supporters, she was a woman betrayed. To her critics, she was finally paying the price for decades of controversy. But in either telling, the truth was the same. The nation was divided, and the storm of reaction revealed not just Camilla's fall, but the monarchy's fragility. But the crown had survived. And at what cost? You'll want to hear how far this storm has spread. Camilla's final walk. The verdict had been spoken, the crown stripped away in silence. In the days that followed, Buckingham Palace moved swiftly to erase her reign. Her cipher vanished from official documents. Portraits that had only recently been hung were quietly removed from gilded walls. Even the royal website was amended, as though history itself had been rewritten overnight. The woman who once stood at the very center of the monarchy now found herself pushed to its margins, reduced to a shadow in the corridors she once occupied. But the most haunting moment came not in the press or on television, but in an image witnessed by those gathered outside Clarence House. Camilla stepped out for what many would call her final walk. There was no crown, no entourage, no ceremonial carriage. Dressed in muted colors, her expression unreadable, she walked slowly down the gravel path of the residence that had once been her shared home with Charles. Behind her, the grand doors closed, not with pomp, but with the heavy finality of dismissal. Crowds lining the street fell into silence. Some watched in pity, others in cold satisfaction. A woman who had endured decades of public scorn had finally been stripped of the prize she had fought to claim. For her supporters, the sight was devastating. Heartbreaking news for Queen Camilla, who had given so much of her life to stand beside Charles only to be abandoned when duty demanded sacrifice. For her detractors, the moment felt like justice. At last, Diana's ghost, settling scores in the most public of ways. The symbolism of that solitary walk was impossible to miss. Once mocked as an interloper, then crowned as consort, Camilla now walked not as queen but as a woman undone. And yet, those who knew her best whispered that her story was not finished. She was heartbroken, yes, but also quietly resolute. Was she preparing to fade into private life, nursing her grief in silence? Or was she already considering a different path, one of discreet revenge, fueled by secrets and letters only she could reveal? The monarchy had survived her downfall, but its fragility had been laid bare. If a queen consort could be erased so swiftly, what else could fracture under pressure? The public was left torn between sympathy and suspicion, unsure whether Camilla's retreat marked closure or the beginning of another chapter in the palace's long history of scandal. Her final walk left behind more questions than answers. Was this truly the end of her reign? The last page of a story defined by controversy and heartbreak? Or was it the calm before a storm, only she had the power to unleash? Camilla's crown has slipped into history, yet her shadow lingers. Was this heartbreak her final chapter, or the monarchy's deepest wound? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more royal revelations.